When my parents announced they were selling the family farm, I thought the hardest part would be watching the place where I grew up disappear. But I never imagined the real shock would come when they revealed they had given the entire $720,000 from the sale to my younger brother, Caleb, to rescue a failing business he had started with his wife, Marissa. My name is Evelyn Carter, and at 36 I had built a quiet life in Cedar Falls, Iowa, running a restoration studio where I repaired antique furniture, raised my daughter with my husband Daniel, and owned a small lakeside cottage that I rented to a retired teacher and her grandson during the summer months. I had spent most of my childhood being told that Caleb simply needed more help because he was still finding his way. While I was praised whenever I managed difficult things without asking anyone for assistance, and over the years that praise became a convenient excuse for giving him opportunities that I never received. I paid my own college expenses by working nights at a grocery store, bought my first workshop with savings from repairing furniture, and even financed the down payment on the cottage myself. So when my mother casually announced over dinner that they planned to move into that property after giving Caleb their savings, I honestly thought she was joking. "Evelyn, sweetheart, you have that little cottage sitting there most of the year, and your tenants can find somewhere else for a few months," my father said, as though he were discussing where to store a few boxes. But I calmly explained that the cottage was under a fixed rental agreement and that the tenants, Margaret and Owen, had nowhere else to go on such short notice. My mother immediately accused me of choosing strangers over family, and when I reminded her that they had voluntarily handed Caleb hundreds of thousands of dollars, she replied with a sentence I would never forget. "Your brother needed a future, and you already have one." I refused to argue, but within a week the pressure became relentless, with phone calls from cousins, messages from family friends, and even a visit from my aunt who insisted that I was being selfish because my parents were now between homes, despite the fact that they had deliberately sold their farm and spent their money before securing another place to live. Daniel listened to every accusation without interrupting, and one evening he finally looked at me across our kitchen table and said, "They aren't asking for help anymore, Evelyn. They're trying to make their decisions your responsibility." Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, Margaret called me in tears because 2 vehicles had arrived at the cottage, and when I asked what was happening, she whispered that my parents were unloading boxes onto the porch, while Caleb stood beside them holding a set of keys he claimed belonged to him. I drove there immediately through sheets of rain and found my father carrying a lamp toward the front door, my mother directing movers around the flower beds, and Caleb standing proudly beside a rented trailer, as if the property had somehow become his the moment our parents gave him their money. "What exactly are you doing?" I demanded, and Caleb gave me an irritated smile before saying, "Dad told me the place was basically ours now, so we figured we'd make the move today," while my father argued that they had nowhere else to go, and my mother insisted that Margaret and Owen could manage somewhere temporary. I stepped between them and the doorway, told the movers to stop, reminded everyone that the property was legally mine and the tenants had an active agreement, and when my father threatened to call the sheriff because I was abandoning my own parents, I answered, "Call whoever you want, because this time I have nothing to hide." Argument ended only when Margaret quietly showed the movers the rental agreement and told them she had already contacted her attorney, causing the men to retreat awkwardly toward the trailer while my mother began crying loudly enough for neighbors to come outside and watch. Caleb leaned close to me before leaving and said, "You are going to regret humiliating us." But I looked at him and replied, "No, Caleb, I'm going to regret that it took me this long to stop letting everyone else make their emergencies my responsibility." Next morning, my family group chat exploded with accusations that I had thrown elderly parents into the street. Even though they were staying at a hotel they could easily afford for several weeks, and had still not explained why giving Caleb their entire nest egg meant I was obligated to surrender my property. Instead of defending myself one message at a time, I created a simple digital folder containing the sale documents, the $720,000 transfer record, the rental agreement, photographs of the cottage, and screenshots of every message in which my parents demanded that I remove Margaret and Owen. Then I sent one calm message to everyone. If you believe my parents need housing immediately, please tell me which of you is willing to provide it. For several hours, nobody responded, and then Caleb's wife Marissa finally called me privately and admitted that their business was in serious trouble because the money my parents had given them had already been used to cover debts, supplier bills, and a large commercial lease they could no longer afford. She confessed that my parents had promised Caleb the cottage would become their safety net if his business collapsed, which explained why he had treated my property like an inheritance that had simply arrived early. And for the first time, I realized the problem was much bigger than my parents needing a place to stay. 3 weeks later, Caleb's business officially closed. My parents were forced to rent a small apartment across town, and the relatives who had spent weeks condemning me suddenly became much quieter when they discovered that the story they had been told was missing almost every important fact. But I still hadn't heard the last word from my brother, because one evening he appeared outside my restoration studio carrying a cardboard box filled with old photographs from the farm, and told me that our parents had given him the box because they believed I would come around eventually. I opened the box and found pictures of myself as a little girl sanding a chair beside my grandfather, my first furniture show, Daniel and me standing beside the cottage after we bought it, and one photograph of my mother holding me after my high school graduation. And for a moment, all the anger disappeared beneath something much more complicated. Caleb watched my face and said quietly, "I know I messed up, but they always told me you could handle anything." And I answered, "Being capable never meant I was supposed to be available for everyone else's consequences." He started to apologize, but before I could respond, Margaret walked into the studio carrying a small envelope and told me she had found it tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the cottage while repairing an old cabinet, and inside was a handwritten letter from my grandfather explaining that he had always hoped the family would protect one another without deciding that one person's future mattered more than another's. I read the letter twice, then realized that protecting someone does not mean allowing them to take what you built, and forgiveness does not require handing them the keys to your life. Months passed, and my parents eventually rebuilt their lives in the apartment they could actually afford, while Caleb found work with a construction company and slowly began paying back a portion of the debts he had created. And although none of us returned to the relationship we once pretended to have, the constant shouting finally stopped. Margaret and Owen renewed their lease at the cottage. Daniel and I finished renovating our daughter's bedroom, and my restoration studio became busier than ever after I began teaching weekend classes to people who wanted to learn the same woodworking skills that had once helped me build a life from almost nothing. The greatest change, however, happened inside me, because I stopped measuring my worth by how much inconvenience I could absorb without complaining and finally understood that being a loving daughter, sister, wife, and mother did not require me to sacrifice my security whenever someone demanded it. My parents had believed the money they gave Caleb entitled them to my property. Caleb had believed my strength meant I owed him another rescue, and our relatives had believed keeping the family together mattered more than respecting the person who was constantly expected to bend. But I finally chose a different definition of family, one built on honesty, consent, responsibility, and boundaries. Looking back, I don't think the most important moment was stopping my parents at the cottage or exposing the truth to the relatives, because the real turning point happened much earlier when I realized that saying no did not make me cruel, and protecting the life I had built did not make me selfish. Sometimes the hardest boundary is the one that forces people to see you as a different person, but if their love depends on your obedience, then what they are losing was never your love in the first place. It was their access to you. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.